You're watching the Everything Network. Vittorio "Little Vic" Amuso was an American mobster and the boss of the Lucchese crime family, who has also been dubbed the Deadly Don by Assistant United States Attorney Charles Rose. His reign is considered one of the bloodiest periods in American mafia history during the late 1980s and early 1990s, alongside his former underboss and close protege Anthony Casso, who turned informant in 1994. Victor Amuso, serving a life sentence since 1992 at the Federal Correctional Complex, Butner, in North Carolina, on murder and racketeering charges. Vic grew up in Canarsie, Brooklyn. In the late 1940s, he was introduced to Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, a prominent captain in the Gagliano crime family, a forerunner of the Lucchese crime family. Amuso acted as a bodyguard and chauffeur for Carmine Tramunti. He later became an enforcer for Profassi crime family mobster Joseph "Crazy Joe" Gallo in Brooklyn. In the early 1960s, the Gallo brothers declared war against longtime crime boss Giuseppe "Joe" Profassi and the old Profassi faction of the family. Amuso would allegedly kill several members of the Profassi faction, but was sent to prison sometime in the early 1960s, along with Joey Gallo and a dozen others, for extortion charges. After Joe Gallo's release from prison in early 1971, the war would continue against the crime family as boss Joseph Colombo was shot. Months later, on April 7, 1972, Joe Gallo was shot to death in Little Italy, Manhattan, New York, while he was celebrating his birthday. Many Colombo crime family members, especially those from the old Gallo crew, defected to other crime families. Amuso went to the Lucchese family sometime during that year as an associate in the 19th Street crew, whose captain was Christopher Furnari. Furnari controlled New York District Council 9, which represented 6,000 workers who painted and decorated hotels, bridges, and subway stations in New York. He managed the council through the union secretary and treasurer, James Bishop, and Bishop's associate, Frank Arnold. Bishop and Arnold would pick up cash payments from the contractors, who charged a 10 to 15% tax on all major commercial painting jobs, and passed the payments to Furnari. The 19th hole, Furnari's social club, was the hub of criminal activity in Bensonhurst. Mobsters from every New York crime family conducted business in the club and socialized over food and drink. In the mid-1960s, aspiring mobsters Vittorio "Vic" Amuso and Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso joined Furnari's crew. He saw that both men could make money and were willing to use violence if needed. Furnari put Amuso and Casso in charge of a large bookmaking operation and debt-collecting operation. In the early 1970s, the five families of New York organized crime decided to open the books, allowing a new generation of mob associates to become made men. Furnari immediately sponsored Amuso and Casso for family membership, and then made them overseers of the Bypass Gang, a highly successful burglary ring. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Bypass Gang reportedly stole hundreds of millions of dollars in cash, jewelry, and other merchandise. In January 1972, Furnari backed and sanctioned the squad of armed robbers who took the famed Pierre Hotel in Manhattan under siege and stole approximately $3 million in jewels and cash. The Pierre Hotel robbery stands as the largest unrecovered hotel robbery in history. The case was never solved. None of the perpetrators ever confessed to the heist, and only a diamond necklace, valued at $780,000, was recovered. The 8 brazen armed robbers were Robert Comfort, Sammy Nallo, Donald Tony the Greek Francos, Al Green, Ali Ben, Robert Bobby Germain, and Al Visconti. In 1980, Furnari was promoted to consigliere in the Lucchese family. He wanted Casso to take over as capo of the 19th hole crew, but Casso declined and endorsed Amuso instead. Casso opted to become Furnari's aide. A consigliere is allowed to have one soldier work directly for him. Furnari now enjoyed enormous influence both within his own family, the other New York families, and crime families from other US cities. He continued to oversee his criminal interests from the 19th hole, but spent much of his time providing advice and mediation for family members, as well as settling disputes with the other families. Furnari reigned as one of New York's top mafia bosses throughout the early 1980s, until his 1985 racketeering indictment. In early 1986, while Furnari was awaiting the commission trial, the Lucchese family uncovered a new, potentially lucrative racket. A Russian-American crime family based in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, run by Ukrainian immigrant Marat Balagula, had started to bootleg gasoline. By collecting gasoline taxes from customers and then not paying them to the government, Balagula was making very large profits. When Colombo crime family capo Michael Franzese started pressing Balagula for extortion payments, Balagula went to Furnari for help. Casso later reported on a meeting at the 19th hole, in which Furnari told Balagula, Amuso became one of Furnari's top protégés, along with Anthony Gaspipe Casso. In December of '72, Amuso was arrested by police outside the house on Morgan Avenue, a front for the Bronx Connection kickback scheme, selling prison paroles for as high as $20,000 to prison inmates. Presumably to meet with the building owner, Richard Curro, a city corrections officer and Lucchese family associate, who acted as liaison between inmates and the Lucchese crime family. Amuso was in possession of a switchblade and a file folder of parole documents at the time of his arrest. In 1977, Victor Amuso became a maidman in the Lucchese crime family. On May 30th, 1977, he was arrested with Anthony Casso for their involvement in a drug trafficking ring smuggling heroin from Bangkok, Thailand. At the time of the Brooklyn mobster's arrest, he had been found with 3 pounds of heroin in his possession. Reportedly, the heroin operation was headed by Amuso, his cooperator Casso, and 2 other associates of the Lucchese crime family. They were all sent to prison. April 13, 1986, the underboss of the Gambino crime family, Frank DeCicco, was killed when a bomb placed under his car went off. The bomb had been planted by Herbert Pate, while Amuso, Casso, and Vic's brother Robert watched from a parked car. The target was allegedly Gambino boss John Gotti, who earlier, with DeCicco, had organized the murder of former boss Paul Castellano without the permission of the commission. Reportedly, Amuso and Casso, along with Genovese crime family boss Vincent Chin Gigante, had planned Gotti's execution, but killed DeCicco by mistake. Although Casso later testified that both he and Amuso had conspired with the Chin, but this was never raised at the trial, because Casso was dropped from the witness protection program many years later. On February 15, 1985, Corallo, Furnari and underboss Salvatore Santoro were indicted in the Mafia Commission trial, along with the top major heads of the 5 families. To replace him, Corallo put his protégé Anthony Buddy Luongo as acting boss sometime in early 1986. However, around December of that same year, Luongo disappeared. It was rumored that Amuso, then Luongo's driver and bodyguard, killed him to remove his last major opponent with the assistance of Casso. By late 1986, Tony Corallo realized that he, Santoro and Furnari were headed for convictions that would send them to prison for life. To avoid internal war and keep up the family's tradition of a peaceful transfer of power, Corallo summoned Amuso and Casso to a meeting at Furnari's house and decided that one of them would succeed him as boss. Funari then met with his two protégés and told them to decide which one would take the mantle. They ultimately decided that it should be Amuso. He was named acting boss later in 1986, and the new official boss on January 13, 1987, when Corallo and others were sentenced to life imprisonment. From 1978 to 1990, 4 of the 5 crime families of New York, including the Lucchese family, rigged bids for 75% of $191 million, or about $142 million, of the window contracts awarded by the New York City Housing Authority. Installation companies were required to make union payoffs of between $1 and $2 for each window installed. Bloodletting only increased after Amuso named Casso as his underboss in 1988. Toward the late 1980s, him and Casso began arguing with Anthony Tumac Axaturo, head of the family's powerful New Jersey faction, the Jersey Crew, about the profit that Axaturo sent to the family administration. Axaturo had only been sending $50,000 a year to New York, but Amuso and Casso wanted half of the Jersey Crew's yearly take. When Axaturo refused, Amuso stripped him of his rank. In the fall of 1988, the entire Jersey Crew was summoned to meet with the boss in Brooklyn. 10 of the crew's members showed up for the meeting. However, fearing that they were being set up to be killed, they all abruptly drove off. In a fury, Amuso ordered the entire Jersey Crew killed, the now infamous Whack Jersey order. Soon, the entire New Jersey Crew had gone into hiding, decimating the crime family's interests in New Jersey. Amuso and Casso went on to eliminate anyone on even the merest suspicion that they might be defectors, or if they were considered potential rivals. Over the next 12 months, most of the New Jersey crew members returned to the family. Vic told the crew members who came back that Axaturo was an outlaw and needed to be disposed of. The boss sent hitmen to Florida to search for Axaturo. However, what the boss didn't realize was that Axaturo was jailed in New Jersey for refusing to testify in front of state panel. He would later become an informant. His former protégé and longtime rival, Michael Mad Dog Taxeta, who was also despised by Amuso, he reputedly took over the Lucchese Jersey Crew in northern New Jersey toward his conviction in 1993, before Axaturo eventually agreed to become an informant. On May 30, 1990, Amuso and Casso were indicted as part of the Windows case racketeering investigation. Acting on prior knowledge, Amuso and Casso went into hiding. Amuso named Alphonse Little Al Diaco as acting boss, but the bloodshed of Vic Amuso and Anthony Casso wasn't over yet, as Captain Peter Fat Pete Chiodo was charged with violations of the RICO Act in 1991. Suspecting that Chiodo had turned informer, Amuso decided to have Chiodo killed. On May 8, 1991, 3 gunmen shot Chiodo 12 times, but failed to kill him. A few weeks later, Amuso sent word to Chiodo's attorneys that his wife had been marked for death. This violated a long-standing mafia rule that women are not to be harmed. Later, a hit team nearly killed Chiodo's sister. The move backfired spectacularly, as Chiodo became a government informant and agreed to testify against several major heads of the 5 families, including Amuso, that same year. Chiodo revealed details of the entire Windows case operation, several murder and conspiracy charges, loan sharking and extortion, as well as money laundering and drug trafficking operations around Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx. Amuso issued several other orders that led many inside and outside the Lucchese family to conclude he was no longer acting rationally. He and Casso crafted a list of 49 people that they wanted dead, half of whom were Lucchese-made men. He also ordered Diaco to bring in a bomb expert from the Philadelphia crime family as part of a plan to blow up Gambino boss John Gotti. Amuso then turned his wrath on Diaco, whom he held responsible for the failed hit on Chiodo. He effectively demoted Diaco by naming a four-man panel to run the family in his absence. On July 29, 1991, FBI agents captured Amuso at a suburban mall outside Scranton, Pennsylvania. There were strong indications that the FBI had been tipped off by someone with knowledge of the clandestine telephone system Amuso used to pass on orders. Shortly afterward, Diaco was set up to be killed at a meeting of top family leaders at a Manhattan hotel. Diaco spotted a man carrying a gun under his shirt. The man later went to the bathroom, and when he came out, the gun was gone. Realizing that the next guy to come out of the bathroom would likely come out shooting, Diaco fled for his life and turned state's evidence. His testimony, and that of Chiodo and many others, proved to be devastating to Amuso's case. In a separate racketeering trial, Amuso was convicted of all 54 charges on June 15, 1991, including 9 murders. On October 9, 1992, Amuso was sentenced to life imprisonment. Casso managed to remain free for 2 more years, until he himself was apprehended in 1993. By then, Amuso had been seething over the circumstances of his arrest for some time, and had come to believe that Casso had tipped off the FBI in hopes of seizing the boss's mantle for himself. In late 1993, Amuso removed Casso as underboss and decreed that all Lucchese family should consider him a pariah, in effect, banishing his comrade of some 3 decades from the family. Casso responded by turning informer himself. After the incarcerations of both Amuso and Casso, the United States government learned that they each had, allegedly, ordered more than 10 to 12 slayings while they were fugitives and while on trial, using 2 corrupt NYPD cops, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, as their personal hitmen. After Amuso's indictment, with the testimony provided by former acting boss Alphonse Little Al Diaco, Amuso promoted his captain Joseph Little Joe DeFeed to acting boss with the help of the ruling panel members Stephen Wonderboy Crea, Anthony Bowat Barata, Salvatore Sal Avellino, and consigliere Frank Big Frank Lastarino in 1991. It was around this time that Lastarino used the indictments of Amuso and Anthony Gaspipe Casso to take advantage of the situation and gained much of the authority in the family when he aligned himself with Brooklyn faction leaders Georgie Neck Zappola, Frank Bones Papagni, Frank Gioia Jr. and George Conte. In early 1992, Amuso feared that rivalry was being developed in the Lucchese crime family, as some mobsters thought, with Amuso out of the way, that they could take over. The rivals were the old Bronx faction of the family, and Amuso felt he had to prove that he was still in charge. On April 3, 1992, Aniello Neil Migliore, one of the most powerful capos of the family, was celebrating the birthday of a friend's granddaughter in a Westbury, New York restaurant on Long Island. During the party, a gunman in a passing car fired 1 or 2 shotgun blasts through the restaurant window, hitting Migliore in the head and chest. Despite his wounds, Migliore survived. The attempt on his life did not sway Migliore away from the crime family, though, as he kept operating throughout the 1990s. As Amuso allegedly attempted to kill Aniello Neil Migliore from the Bronx faction in 1992, he chose another Bronx faction leader named Stephen Wonderboy Crea as the new and powerful underboss of the Lucchese crime family to keep rivals from the Bronx in line. However, this decision almost triggered a new war within the crime family, as Crea, along with Joseph Little Joe DeFede, decided to turn the family's power center away from Brooklyn, New York, and back to the Bronx faction where it had been for decades. This, however, didn't please the imprisoned boss Vic Amuso and his supporters within the Brooklyn faction. Crime family consigliere Frank Big Frank Lastarino, sought to organize the murder of Stephen Crea using capos George Zappala, Frank Papagni, and Frank Gioia Jr., and would further plan to use the death of acting boss Steve Crea to gain the control of the Lucchese crime family. Law enforcement also recognized these members as the actual leaders of the family at the time, and even picked them up on wires and bugs, saying they were going to kill Gambino crime family boss John Jr. Gotti, son of John Gotti, and his rival Nicholas Little Nick Carozzo, to split up the Gambinos. This conspiracy also included Genovese crime family boss Vincent Chin Gigante and On the Lam leader Anthony Gaspipe Casso before he was apprehended. But due to massive indictments of the time, slashing all members of the three families involved in the conspiracy, the plot never succeeded, and Amuso continued to run the family from prison, as most of the conspirators themselves were sent to prison. During the mid-1990s, the majority of the Brooklyn faction leaders, many of whom were known Amuso's rivals, were sent to prison on various charges. To keep some sense of stability within the Lucchese crime family, Vic promoted his loyal friend and Brooklyn capo Louis Bagels Didone to the position of consigliere, replacing Frank Lastarino. Amuso also kept Joseph Little Joe DeFede as the crime family's acting boss. DeFede oversaw important crime family operations, such as those in the garment district, which brought in between $40,000 to $60,000 a month. Amuso kept Stephen Wonderboy Crea of the Bronx as the underboss, overseeing the construction and union racketeering operations that made the crime family between $300,000 and $500,000 a month. Didone was put in control of the crews and street soldiers that took care of all the debt collection and muscle work, basically the collection of gambling and loan sharking debts, the extortion operations, and allegedly murder for hire. After Didone was promoted to the number 3 spot, Long Island captain Joseph Caridi stepped up to run Didone's former crew. On April 28, 1998, Joe DeFede was indicted on 9 counts of racketeering, stemming from his supervision of the crime family rackets in New York's Garment District from 1992 to 1997. In December 1998, Joe pleaded guilty to the charges and received 5 years in prison. Angry at his guilty plea, Amuso became uncertain of Joe's loyalty to the crime family, and in the future, Amuso would regard him as a traitor and thief. After the imprisonment of Joe in 1998, Amuso handpicked Bronx faction leader Stephen Wonderboy Crea as the new acting boss of the Lucchese crime family. Crea, a loyal Amuso underboss, began sending a larger amount of the crime family's profits to the imprisoned boss, which convinced Amuso that Joe had been skimming profits from the crime family the whole time he was acting boss. Amuso decided to put out a contract on Joe's life in late 1999. On September 6, 2000, Crea and 7 other crime family members were arrested and jailed on extortion charges. Crea was eventually convicted in 2001 and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Stephen Crea was released from prison in 2006. Following the imprisonment of Crea in 2001, influential consigliere Louis Bagels Didone was promoted to acting boss and began to run the day-to-day operations of the crime family. Didone, at the time one of the strongest and most dangerous family members, would continue to oversee the contract ordered by Amuso on his imprisoned former acting boss, Little Joe. Joe did not know that Amuso had placed a contract on his life, but during Joe's imprisonment, he was demoted from capo to soldier, and this alerted him to the possibility that he had fallen out of favor with boss Vic Amuso and could be in serious trouble. Upon Joe's release from prison on February 5, 2002, it was reported that the former Amuso ally immediately turned to the government for help and became an informant. Federal witnesses Joe DeFede and Alphonse Little Al Diaco gave the government information regarding Lucchese-controlled racketeering operations based around New York City, which helped the federal government continue their decimation of the old Amuso faction. Both Diaco and DeFede also provided information about rackets such as gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and even information about some old murders, which led to the indictments of mafia cops, Luis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa. Ippolito and Caracappa were allegedly working for and taking large bribes from former Lucchese underboss Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso since the 1980s. The two highly decorated NYPD officers were apparently used by Casso and the Lucchese crime family to gain valuable information about ongoing police investigations and cases concerning New York Mafia member. The two bad cops were also used to lure rivals and possible government informants to their deaths, and in some cases, they apparently executed the victims themselves. Didone received a life sentence in 2003 on racketeering and murder charges, while more than a dozen other prominent Lucchese crime family members were sent to prison during that same year on various charges. After the conviction and imprisonment of acting boss Louis Didone in 2003, Amuso instituted a new ruling panel, Committee of Influential Capos, to oversee and run the crime family's day-to-day activities. Prominent and senior Lucchese captain Aniello Neil Migliore, Matthew "Matt" Madonna, and Joseph "Joey" D. DiNapoli were handpicked by Amuso to lead the crime family. These senior capos were chosen as street bosses to work in tandem. Instead of placing one particular member in the official underboss position, Amuso divided the power between three influential captains. Migliore, a former Corallo loyalist and Amuso rival, is now said to be one of the most powerful mobsters in the crime family. In 2006, former acting boss Stephen "Wonderboy" Crea was released from prison, and the ruling panel's committee continued to run day-to-day activities of the crime family. In late 2009, ruling panel members Madonna and DiNapoli were indicted on labor racketeering, illegal gambling, and extortion charges. In 2009, Stephen Crea took over as acting boss of the crime family. As of July 2014, Amuso was still the official boss of the crime family. In May 2019, government witness and former soldier John Panisi testified in the trial against Eugene Castell and revealed the current leadership of the crime family. Panisi testified that in 2017, imprisoned for life boss Vic Amuso sent a letter to underboss Stephen Crea, which stated that Brooklyn-based mobster Michael "Big Mike" DeSantis would take over as acting boss, replacing Bronx-based Matthew Madonna. The testimony from Panisi stated that if the Bronx faction refused to step aside, imprisoned boss Amuso had approved of a hit list that included a captain and several members of the Bronx faction. During Panisi's testimony, he revealed that the Lucchese crime family operates with a total of 7 crews, 2 in the Bronx, 2 on Long Island, 1 in Manhattan, 1 in New Jersey, and Castellucci's Brooklyn crew, formerly Amuso Casso's old crew, which is now based in Tottenville section of Staten Island. Law enforcement agents have stated that Brooklyn-based mobster Patty "Red" Della Russo is the new acting underboss, and that the Bronx-based mobster Andrew DeSimone is the new consigliere. Domenico "Danny" Cutaia was the captain of the Vario crew operating from Brooklyn. His son, Salvatore Cutaia, is a member of the crew. His daughter Danielle married John Bardanza, who later became a member of the Lucchese family. Cutaia worked as a loan shark and as a chauffeur for Captain Paul Vario. While working for Vario, he also controlled some illegal gambling operations and had control of the Carpenters Union local in Brooklyn. He later took over as capo of Vario's crew in Brooklyn. During the early 1990s, he was a member of a ruling panel along with Stephen Creer and Joseph DeFedid, running the crime family. He was indicted for extortion in '95, loan sharking and racketeering. In 1996, he pled guilty to extortionate extensions of credit and was sentenced to 30 months in prison. Cutaia was indicted again in 2002 on loan sharking charges. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 2 years and 3 years of supervised probation upon his release. He was released 3 years later from prison. His parole terms banned him from communicating with family members until August 2008. However, in January 2007, it was reported that Cutaia was the primary liaison between jailed boss Vittorio Vic Amuzzo and the three-man panel of captains who were running the family. On February 28, 2008, Cutaia, his son Salvatore, his son-in-law John Bodanza, and former acting captain Michael Corcioni were indicted on federal racketeering charges that included loan sharking, extortionate collection of credit, extortion, marijuana distribution conspiracy, illegal gambling, bank fraud, and mail fraud for activities dating back to the 1980s. On October 25, 2009, Cutaia was sentenced to 3.5 years in federal prison for bank fraud. At the sentencing, Cutaia's attorney asked the court for home confinement, saying that Cutaia suffered from depression and advanced multiple sclerosis. The request was denied. In October 2012, he was sentenced to 1 year in prison for loan sharking. Cutaia was released from prison on October 4, 2013. He died on August 14, 2018. You're watching the Everything Network. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York City in 1960, George Zappala joined the Lucchese crime family, working for the Brooklyn faction in the mid-80s. He became one of Anthony Casso's closest allies, and in 1990 he was promoted to captain. Both his father and uncle were small-time associates of the mob and were murdered by unknown gunmen in homicides that were never solved. Despite this, George still wanted to become a made man in the mafia. A Brooklyn faction leader, Zappala joined the labor and construction racketeering operation that earned the most money for the family. This operation was run by Stephen Creer of the Bronx faction. He helped Anthony oversee his various business enterprises. A bagel factory that supplied local McDonald's restaurants. He also worked the numbers rackets and slot machines. He enjoyed watching Major League Baseball games and fights in bars around Brooklyn. He was a regular patron of Bruno's hair salon in Bensonhurst, where he would get a massage and pedicure from time to time. He was fastidious about his appearance and obsessed about his weight, walking 6 miles every day to stay trim. He wore a gold watch that was a gift from Casso, inscribed, "A true friend," from Anthony. George was careless about police surveillance and electronic counter-surveillance, and carried a cell phone to which only Casso had the number. He was Casso's most trusted killer. In 1987, George Zappala participated in the ambush murder of Lucchese captain Michael Papadio. Michael was a rich captain of the Lucchese family, earning an estimated $1 million a year from his garment racketeering business. He owed a large house in Queens worth $2 million, an apartment at 35 Park Avenue in Manhattan, a condo in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a house in the Hamptons, and drove a Mercedes S-Class. Michael had been a made man in the Lucchese crime family for many years, getting his stripes sometime between 1974 and 1977. He was a member of the Harlem Bronx faction, based in the northern areas of New York City. He was promoted to captain after the murder of his older brother Andimo, who was murdered outside his home in Lido Beach, Long Island, on September 25, 1976. Michael had been in place for many years, taking over the position on the death of his brother, and as such, was one of the most powerful crime figures in the area. Not only was he a huge earner, but he also operated a very lucrative loan sharking business in the streets, one that grossed millions of dollars each year. He was allegedly hiding the money gained from over 50 businesses away from the family for his own benefit. He had earned $15 million that boss was unaware of. He was called to a meeting with bosses Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso in Manhattan to explain his side of the story. In a violent and heated confrontation, Amuso demoted Michael from his job in the garment industry, demanding he hand it over all record books he was maintaining that involved details on the companies and unions that the family controlled. The meeting ended with Michael refusing to hand over his business. He told Amuso and Casso that they have brought nothing but destruction and division amongst the family for being too greedy, then walked out of the meeting, vowing to stay on the job, ignoring Amuso's demands. The boss warned him that if he persisted, he would issue instructions to have him killed. But like a man with a death wish, Michael Papadio kept walking out and continued to involve himself in the day-to-day running of the family's garment district affairs. In the months after the meeting, Captain Alphonse Diaco met with Michael Papadio several times to try and convince him to hand over his businesses, saying that Amuso would spare his life if he obeyed the orders. But Mikey was too stubborn to give up his businesses. He constantly asked what for, and he wanted proof that he was stealing money. On the day of his murder, Papadio and his wife Frances left their home in Queens at 8:30 in the morning. They stopped at the diner where he told her he was going for a coffee before heading next door to pick up some fruit and vegetables. They agreed to meet in an hour. She drove off to do her own shopping. She returned about 10 a.m., but Michael was not waiting for her. He had met up with Captain Salvador Avellino and his son Carmine at the diner, and they both went to a bakery in Queens, owned by Avellino. When Michael and the Avellinos arrived at the bakery, they went inside. Alphonse Diaco and George Zappola waited to carry out the killing. Diaco was carrying a copper wire cable wrapped in blue insulation tape. Zappola was holding a .22 revolver. As Carmine Avellino led Michael through the bakery towards the rear office area, Diaco sprang out from behind a pillar and started bashing Michael around the head with a makeshift weapon. To everyone's surprise, the man remained standing, blood streaming from his face. He screamed out, "Why are you hitting me?" Zappola stepped up, produced a revolver, and shot Michael. The bullet actually ricocheted off his head, striking a door frame, and amazingly Michael remained standing, holding his face between his hands. Zappola then pulled out a snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver and shot Michael again in the head. Unbelievably, he still remained on his feet, his legs now spread wide to support his dying body. Salvador Avellino, Alphonse Diaco, and George Zappola stood around attacking him until he fell to his knees and collapsed onto the floor, dead. In February 1990, Zappola traveled to Los Angeles, California, to supervise a hit on fellow Lucchese soldier Anthony Dallapie, which was carried out by Alphonse Diaco's son, Little Joe Diaco. On the night in question, Diaco and Zappola were dressed in hooded sweatshirts. Little Joe had a .380 Beretta and a .357 Magnum. Zappola remained hidden, supervising Little Joe and ensuring that Dallapie was actually murdered. Dallapie walked into a parking garage carrying a garment bag. Little Joe stepped out of the shadows and shot him. Diaco walked over to Dallapie and delivered a shot directly into his head. In May 1990, Zappola and George Conte shot James D. Bishop, a Democratic district leader and former head of the Painters Union in Whitestone, Queens, as he was parking his car. The Lucchese family had controlled and looted the District Council 9 of the International Brotherhood of Painters and Allied Trades for years. The mobsters would receive kickbacks from contractors in exchange for bid rigging and allowing the use of cheaper non-union workers. When it appeared that Bishop might cooperate with prosecutors in a state investigation of the district council, the Lucchese family ordered Zappola and Conte to murder him. The early 1990s turned into a disaster for the Lucchese family. In 1991, Vittorio Musso was convicted on murder charges and sentenced to life in prison. With Musso in prison, Casso assumed the family leadership and became the new boss. However, Casso was soon indicted himself on murder and racketeering charges and fled the state. During this period, Cree was elevated to underboss, acting on direct orders from the absent Musso and Casso. In 1993, Casso was finally captured in New Jersey. George Zappola and captains Frank Papagni and Frank Gioia Jr. saw an opportunity to wrest power away from underboss Cree. With his ascension to power, Cree had shifted the family's base of power away from Brooklyn. The power bases for Zappola, Papagni, and Gioia were in Manhattan and the Bronx, the historic power base of the Lucchese family. Zappola, Papagni, Gioia, and consigliere Frank Lastarino started planning to murder Stephen Crea. The disaffected mobsters also conspired with Anthony Casso to kill then-acting boss of the Gambino crime family, John Jr. Gotti, in retaliation for the killing of Patrick Testa. Allegedly, Zappola and his fellow conspirators also wanted to kill Gotti's rival, Nicholas Corazzo, in an attempt to split up the Gambino family by causing an internal civil war. Unfortunately for Zappola and the other mobsters, legal problems thwarted all of their plotting. Mathematically, after his 1993 capture, Anthony Casso decided to avoid prison by becoming a government witness. Towards 1994, Zappola was indicted on racketeering and murder charges. As it turned, Casso was dropped from the witness protection program and sent to prison for life. Although Casso never testified, the threat of his testimony convinced Gioia to cooperate with the government for protection. Gioia's testimony would lead to massive indictments of racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, bribery, money laundering, fraud, conspiracy, and murder charges. As winter of 1993 through 1994 set in, and Casso's March trial date neared, he had grown more desperate. After two previously failed breakout attempts, Casso dreamt up the idea of ambushing the bus that transported prisoners from the MCC in Lower Manhattan to the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse. Casso instructed Zappola to surveil the area. Recently promoted to captain, Zappola had hidden out in California and Florida for a time before returning to New York City to assist Casso and oversee his various business enterprises, and was therefore entrusted with coordinating his breakout. After studying the path the bus followed, Zappola decided the optimal place for an assault. The assault was opposite the Jehovah's Witness Watchtower building, a few blocks from Brooklyn's federal courthouse. The area was mostly industrial, with a warren of streets linked to a series of local avenues and express ramps. Multiple escape routes were available. Casso's crew on the outside would overtake the bus, cut the locks on its doors, and shoot their way in to free Casso, paramilitary style. The plan for the assault on the bus caused divisions among the Lucchese's incarcerated. Casso was determined to go, and so was Frank Lastarino. But Sal Avellino, another wise guy facing RICO charges, was going to stay on the bus when the others ran, as was Michael DeSantis. The plan presented enormous difficulties. First, the plotters had to be sure Casso was actually on the bus on the day they struck, a difficult thing to accomplish due to tightly restricted communications with prisoners. An acting Lucchese captain visited Casso in prison often. In preparation for the escape, Casso and his captain surreptitiously swapped running shoes during one visit. The shoes worn by prisoners were standard-issue rubber-soled laceless sneakers. There were two electronic signal devices hidden in the soles of the pair Casso kept. The crew on the outside would be able to detect the signal and know that Casso was on the bus when they hit it. Planning continued into the new year as Casso's collaborators monitored his hearing dates. Finally, their chance came. Early in 1994, on a cold winter day, Casso was in court by dawn. At 10 in the morning, the captains took up position at the corner of Camman Plaza and outside the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse, waiting for the prisoner bus to emerge from the gated Sally Port. As soon as he received a signal from Casso's sneaker, the captain would contact one of the crew by radio. The attack would begin. But hours passed, and the bus failed to emerge from the courthouse. The captain remained on his watch until 2:30 in the afternoon, when he abandoned his post due to the cold. He hadn't received Casso's signal. The bus was delayed that day due to the extreme weather. Casso didn't return to the prison until 5:30. In January 1995, George Zappala was indicted on federal charges linking him to 4 killings and conspiracies to kill other members of the Lucchese family. In January of 96, he was indicted in a murder and racketeering indictment. In June 1996, Zappala pleaded guilty to several murders, including the 1990 bishop's slaying. Zappala was eventually sentenced to 22 years in prison. Anthony Axaturo, born 1938, is a former captain and leader of the New Jersey faction of the Lucchese crime family called the Jersey Crew. He ran the family's Jersey operations for many years before being sent to state prison. He and his family moved to Newark, New Jersey, sometime in the late 1940s. Anthony hung out with a bunch of young tough guys and was a brawler himself. He became the leader of the large street gang at 18 years old. Axaturo was recruited by Anthony Ham Delasco during the 1960s for the Lucchese crime family. Delasco ran his crew from East Orange, New Jersey, where he controlled jukebox machines, cigarette vending machines, illegal gambling, and loan sharking operations in Newark, New Jersey. In the late 1950s, he worked as Delasco's driver and protege, learning trades in illegal gambling and loan sharking that was controlling the Newark, New Jersey area. When Delasco died in the late 1960s, and Joseph Arbody became the new captain of the Jersey Crew, Anthony would be a lot more involved in organized crime under the guidance of Joe. In the 1920s, Joe reportedly served as an enforcer for Al Capone in Chicago before settling in New Jersey. According to newspaper records, he headed Lucchese interests in New Jersey by the 1970s, commanding over 100 mobsters and associates. Axaturo moved to Florida to avoid an investigation of his gambling operations in Newark. Another reason for his move was that South Florida was open to all the crime families for exploitation. During his absence, he designated his lieutenant, Michael Tixetta of New Jersey, to run the day-to-day operations of the crew. In the early 1970s, Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo put Axaturo in charge of the entire Lucchese operation in New Jersey, even though he wasn't yet a family member. Axaturo and his crew of new muscle helped Joe, who was still the official senior captain, keep control over the Jersey Crew. The delay in his initiation occurred because none of the New York families were accepting new members during this period. However, Corallo and Axatura had a great relationship. In 1976, with help from his old friend Joe, Axatura finally became a made man in the Lucchese crime family, along with the Taxeta brothers, Michael and Martin. He would finally become the official captain of the Jersey crew by 1979, when Joe retired. Axatura was indicted for loan sharking and extortion in February 1973. He was eventually arrested in Miami, Florida, with his bail set at $10,000. 3 years later, the state of New Jersey tried to extradite Axatura from Florida. However, he fended off the order due to poor health. Based in Hollywood, Florida, he would continue to elude federal authorities while remaining involved in Lucchese operations in New Jersey. He was a man of almost unlimited luck when it came to being tried for his crimes. He once avoided prosecution by claiming to have Alzheimer's disease, only to experience a miraculous cure when he slipped and fell in the shower after the case against him was dropped. In 1980, the murder of boss Angelo Bruno created a power vacuum in the Philadelphia crime family, with rivals Philip Testa and Nicodemo Scarfo fighting for control. Anthony used this unrest to establish a small foothold for the Lucchese family in Philadelphia, using Michael Taxeta and his brother Martin. Axatura was indicted in 1985 on charges of threatening government witnesses and posing a threat to public safety. He was later charged with intimidating competitors of the Lucchese-controlled Taxeta Group enterprises, along with credit card and wire fraud charges. Facing a number of federal prosecutions, he was granted a stay of sentence and was allowed to live in his Florida residence. In 1987, Anthony Axatura and Michael Taxeta went on trial for narcotics and racketeering charges. One of the longest trials in U.S. history, the trial went on for 21 months. When the verdict was read, the defendants were pronounced not guilty on all counts, a stunning rebuke to the government. During the RICO trials, the relationship between Axatura and Taxeta deteriorated into an outright power struggle. Taxeta was jealous of the rise of Axatura's son, Anthony Axatura Jr., within the New Jersey crew. Taxeta also felt that Anthony Sr. had given him very little respect over the years, that he had been watching over the New Jersey operations for him. Finally, Taxeta ordered a murder contract on the senior Axatura. When the trial ended in acquittals for the defendants, Axatura returned to Florida for his own safety. In September 1989, New Jersey authorities extradited Anthony Axatura from North Carolina due to his refusal to appear and testify before a grand jury about labor racketeering and other state offenses. Due to Taxeta's murder contract, the state placed Axatura in protective custody. In 1993, Ann Taxeta was sent to federal prison. In late 1986, Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo, along with underboss Alvador Santoro and consigliere Christopher Fornari, were handed a 100-year sentence in the 1986 commission case. Corallo replacement, Anthony Luongo, turned up missing. Christopher Fornari then suggested narcotics trafficker Vittorio Amuso become new boss of the Lucchese crime family. Corallo was said to have wanted Lucchese captain Aniela Miglia, who was a good friend, to become boss, but he was tied up with legal troubles in the courts. Corallo reluctantly approved Amuso to become the boss of the family. The new leaders of the Lucchese crime family in Brooklyn, NY, Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso, suspended the family's relationship with the New Jersey crew. During the last years of Corallo's reign, Axatura had been steadily decreasing his tribute to the point that he was only giving the family a measly $50,000 a year. Amuso and Casso knew this was way too little, and instead demanded that Axatura turn over 50% of the crew's proceeds to them. When Axatura refused such a high tribute of 50%, the two bosses attempted to strip Axatura of his rank as captain and threatened to kill him. In the fall of 1988, the entire New Jersey crew was summoned to meet with Amuso in Brooklyn. Fearful of being massacred, just about everyone refused to go. Soon, the entire New Jersey crew had gone into hiding, decimating the Lucchese interests in New Jersey. Over the next year or two, most of the New Jersey crew members returned to the family. Amuso told the returning New Jersey crew members that Axaturo was an outlaw and needed to be killed. Although the crew disagreed with Amuso, who was known for unsanctioned hits from paranoia, the Jersey crew felt Amuso had no respect for Jersey's ruling commission or the Mafia Code of Conduct, which is how the New Jersey crew was able to operate successfully, controlling the Newark, New Jersey area for years prior to the retirement of guys like Joseph Abadie. The returning members also had respect for Anthony Axaturo. It was clear that boss Victor Amuso was the cause of the family almost becoming extinct in New Jersey a year earlier. Amuso sent hitmen to Florida to deal with Axaturo. However, it was later pointed out that Axaturo was in jail in New Jersey for refusing to testify in front of a state panel. In 1993, Axaturo was convicted on racketeering charges. His sentence ended in the mid-2000s. He is still alive and well in 2021, escaping the wrath of Amuso and Casso. Anthony Casso was a violent youth and a member of the infamous South Brooklyn Boys Street Gang. In 1958, he was arrested after a rumble against a rival Irish-American gang. He soon caught the eye of Christopher "Christy Tick" Fenari, a Lucchese family mobster and leader of the 19th Hole crew in Brooklyn. With Fenari's support, Casso started his career in the Mafia, running a small loan sharking operation. Fenari also used Casso as muscle for his gambling and drug-dealing rackets. Casso's first arrest, for attempted murder, occurred in 1961, but he was acquitted when the alleged victim refused to identify him as the attacker. In 1974, at age 32, he became a made man of the Lucchese family. Casso joined Vincent Fesseri's crew that operated from 116th Street in Manhattan and from 14th Avenue in Brooklyn. Shortly after becoming a maid, Casso became close to another rising star in the family, Victor Amuso, and began a partnership that lasted for 2 decades. The two men committed scores of crimes, including drug trafficking, burglary, the elimination and disposal of police informants, and murder. Casso and Amuso were noticed for their success, and subsequently moved to the more prominent crew operated by Casso's mentor, Fenari. Within Fenari's 19th Hole crew, both Casso and Amuso led a burglary ring known as the Bypass Gang, which included expert locksmiths, safecrackers, and experts in security alarm systems. The Bypass Gang is still suspected of committing burglaries in banks and jewelry stores throughout New York City and Long Island. Authorities estimated the Bypass Gang stole more than $100 million from safety deposit boxes and vaults during the 1970s and 1980s. In December 1985, Casso was approached by Captain Frank DeCicco regarding a planned coup in the Gambino crime family. Gambino captain at the time, John Gotti, whose crew had worked with Casso to conduct drug deals, and other captains, were planning to kill family boss Paul Castellano, believing that he was too weak to lead them. Gotti and DeCicco were looking for support among the other 4 families affected by the ongoing Mafia Commission trial. According to Sammy Gravano, another of Gotti's co-conspirators, DeCicco returned from the meeting, saying that Casso had offered the conspirators his unconditional support. According to Casso, DeCicco alleged during their meeting that Castellano's carelessness in allowing his own house to be bugged was reason enough to kill him. Casso later told Carlo that he tried to talk DeCicco out of killing a boss without first asking for the commission's permission. Otherwise, he said, killing Castellano would be a cardinal violation of the rules, and all the participants would have to be murdered by the other 4 families. Castellano's murder went ahead anyway on December 16, 1985. Casso later denounced Gotti's actions to Carlo as the beginning of the end of our thing. As Casso had warned, Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo and Genovese boss Vincent Gigante decided to kill Gotti, De Cicco, and every other conspirator in Castellano's murder. Amuso and Casso were chosen to handle the assassinations, and you know the rest. If not, rewind the video. While at the top of the crime family, Amuso and Casso shared huge profits from their family's illegal activities. These profits included $15,000 to $20,000 a month from extorting Long Island delivery and carting companies, $75,000 a month in kickbacks from 8 air freight carriers operating in the New York area in exchange for guaranteed labor peace and no protests from workers over their low benefits, $20,000 a week in profits from illegal, unlicensed video game machines set up in businesses with connections to the Lucchese family, and $245,000 annually from a major family-owned concrete supplier. Amuso and Casso also split more than $200,000 per year from the Garment District protection rackets, as well as a cut of all the crimes committed by the family's soldiers. In one instance, Casso and Amuso split $800,000 from the Colombo family for Casso's aid in helping them rob steel from a construction site at the West Side Highway in Manhattan. In another instance, the two bosses received $600,000 from the Gambino family for allowing it to take over a Lucchese protected contractor for a housing complex project on Coney Island. Casso also controlled Greek-American crime boss George Kalakatas, who gave Casso $683,000 in protection money in 1990 alone to operate a loan-sharking, extortion, and illegal gambling organization in Astoria, Queens. Casso had a close alliance with Russian boss Marat Balagula, who operated a multi-billion-dollar gasoline bootlegging scam in Brighton Beach. Balagula, a Soviet Jewish refugee from Odessa, had arrived in the US under the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. After Colombo Captain Michael Franzese began shaking down his crew, Balagula approached Christopher Fenari, consigliere for the crime family, and asked for a sit-down at the 19th Hole Cruise Social Club in Brooklyn. According to Casso, Fenari declared, "Here, there's enough for everybody to be happy, to leave the table satisfied. What we must avoid is trouble between us and the other families. I propose to make a deal with the others so there's no bad blood. Meanwhile, we will send word out that from now on you and your people are with the Lucchese family. No one will bother you. If anyone does bother you, come to us and Anthony will take care of it." You're watching the Everything Network. The night they gave him Lee Schleifer, Brooklyn felt close and low, the streets pressed in by 3-story brick, and the L rumbling in the distance like a warning the city had learned to ignore. Inside the social club, the air was thick with smoke, the TV in the corner humming through a Yankee replay nobody was actually watching. Christy Tick Fornari sat at the card table in the back like a judge who'd already read the verdict, his eyes on the young tough standing in front of him. Casso had that restless dock rat energy, shoulders a little too square, hands that didn't know what to do when they weren't hurting someone. Fornari's voice barely rose over the clack of pool balls and murmured arguments about point spreads. "This kid Schleifer," he said, tapping 2 fingers lightly on the felt. "He moves dope with us. He eats with us. And now I'm hearing he might be sitting new with people he don't belong sitting with. Agents, narco guys. You understand what that means?" Casso did. In that world, there were only 2 categories of people who talked to law: victims and dead men. "You sure?" he asked, his tone more curious than doubtful. Fenari nodded once, slow and heavy. "I'm sure enough. He's ours. He's your problem now. You handle it, you do it right, I'll put my name on you. You'll be a man after this." The offer hung in the stale air heavier than the smoke, a contract and a promise wrapped together. Later, out on the sidewalk under a weak street lamp, Casso lit a cigarette and watched the traffic crawl by on the avenue. Mid-1970s Brooklyn wasn't polished yet. It was all busted curbs, dented Buicks, and the hum of trouble in a dozen languages. He thought about the steps from here to being in for real. The button, the seat at the table, not being the kid sent to run errands, but the man whose name made other men straighten up. All of that, Furnari had just said, ran straight through one junk-dealing schmuck named Lee Schleifer, who had forgotten that you don't use the family and then use the cops. The play was simple enough. Lee trusted him, saw him as another hungry earner trying to climb. You call, you say there's something new coming in, a piece of action to talk about, maybe a beef to smooth out. Lee, swing by the club tonight. Christy wants to hear your side on this thing. Casso rehearsed in his head, tasting the words, finding the tone that would sound like a favor instead of a summons. He pictured Schleifer's face, the nervous grin, the little bounce in his step when money was in the air. Behind that, he saw the .22 with the long can he'd already picked up, wrapped in an oily rag in the trunk of his car, more tool than weapon. Made for quiet rooms, and men who never saw it coming. When Schleifer walked into the club, the night had already decided what it was going to be. The front room smelled like espresso and sweat, guys leaning on the bar, a couple of them breaking off mid-conversation to give Lee that quick up and down that said he was tolerated, not respected. Casso came off the wall and greeted him with a clasp of hands and a pat on the shoulder. "Lee, you made good time," he said, voice easy, eyes flat. "Christie's in the back, wanted to hear from you himself." Schleifer looked pleased at that, like a junior salesman told the boss wants his opinion. He smoothed his collar, nodded to a couple of faces he thought might matter, and followed Casso down the narrow hallway past the restrooms toward the back room where the real business usually happened. Only tonight that room was dark, the door half closed. "He's in there. Go ahead," Casso said, hanging back a beat. Schleifer pushed the door open, stepped into shadow, his mouth already forming the start of a greeting. He never finished it. By the time the lights flicked on, it was already over. Casso had stepped in behind him, the .22 already in his hand, barrel fitted with the suppressor that made the whole gun look thin and obscene, like something meant for putting down animals. The first shot cracked the quiet like a snapped stick, a soft, vicious sound in the small room, the slug punching into the back of Schleifer's head and snapping him forward into the stack of chairs in front of him. The second and third shots were reflex and insurance. If you're sent to kill a suspected cooperator, you don't leave room for doubt or doctors. Blood splashed the cheap paneling and the back of a faded Sinatra poster, Schleifer's body crumpling in a way that stripped it of any trace of personality, of the jokes he told at the bar, the deals he tried to cut. Casso stood over him for a second, breathing through his nose, the gun steady in his hand, watching the last twitch before stillness. There were no last words, no plea, no big cinematic confession, just a job done and a problem erased. He wiped the weapon down with a rag, slid it back into his waistband, and stepped out into the hallway, closing the door with a casual push of 2 fingers. In the main room, the noise swallowed him like nothing had happened. Somebody laughed too loud at a story, coins clinked as they slammed down for another round, a bartender flicked ash into an already crowded tray. Casso walked back to Fornari's table, the smoky light making his face look older than it had an hour before. Christy Tick studied him, not asking, not needing the details. In that life, you didn't paint word pictures of what you'd just done. You either did it or you didn't. "All right?" Fornari asked, almost bored. Casso nodded once. "All right," he said. That was enough. A silent ledger had been updated in the room. One suspected informant gone, one young enforcer stepped over an invisible line. In the months that followed, the formalities would come, the ceremony, the prick of the finger, the saint's card, Fenari's sponsorship into the Lucchese family, recognition that he had made his bones and could now sit among men who'd already crossed that threshold. But the real moment that counted was here, in this smoky Brooklyn clubhouse on an unremarkable night, with a dead drug dealer cooling in the back room and Anthony Gaspipe Casso walking out into the Brooklyn air as something different than he had been when the sun went down. At 3 a.m, New York looked dead from the rooftop, but Vic knew better. Down on the avenue, beyond the dark stretch of sidewalk and the shuttered storefronts, there were lights in the bank's back office, timers ticking inside steel, motion detectors blinking like tired eyes in the dark. Up here there was just cold tar, the hum of the city bleeding through the night, and Gaspipe Casso, a hooded sweatshirt over his broad shoulders, watching the alley like he was on a hunting stand. The rest of the bypass gang moved like mechanics instead of thieves, crawling over the roof with coils of cable and canvas bags, a muffled drill, a pry bar wrapped in tape. 15 men when they were at full strength, electricians, alarm techs, locksmiths, safe men. Vic and Gas weren't the ones turning screws. They were the ones making sure the screws got turned and that the Lucchese slice came off the top before anyone else saw a dollar. The night had a rhythm they understood. The lookout down on the corner with a newspaper he couldn't read in the dark. The stolen van, double parked with its lights off. The small talk between two guys on the roof about nothing. Baseball, a girl in Bay Ridge, the rent, while 50 feet below them, $1 million in diamonds slept in safe deposit boxes. Clock's running, Vic murmured without looking at his watch, a thick overcoat hiding the shape of a pistol at his hip. He had that older brother calm about him, stocky frame, slicked hair, a face that didn't move much unless something amused him. I don't want to be standing up here when the sun hits that glass. Gaspipe took a drag, nodded toward the hatch one of the techs had just opened by defeating the alarm on the roof door. Relax, Vic, he said, low and even. They cut the zone, it's dead, we got time. Under the hood, his eyes were busy, tracking the alley, the opposite roofline, the rare passing car. He didn't need to see the wires. He trusted the men who saw them, because they worked for the family, and they'd seen what happened to people who tried to shave a score behind his back. Down through the hatch, they went in a file, soft-soled shoes on industrial steps, the smell shifting from winter air and tar to disinfectant, and the faint metallic tang of a bank's insides. Another man waited at the bottom, ear to the panel, fingers tracing a maze of colored wires. Zone 1, Zone 2, phone line, he whispered. Give me 60 seconds. They called it the bypass gang because that's what they did. They didn't smash, they didn't blast, they bypassed. Alarm systems that respectable banks and jewelry houses spent a fortune on were just puzzles to these guys, something to be studied over coffee and blueprints at a kitchen table in Brooklyn a week before the job. Vic at the head of the table, Gaspipe at his elbow. In those sit-downs, nobody raised their voice. We're not cowboys, Vic would say, tapping the paper with a calloused finger. We're going under the radar. You're in and out. No drama. The tech would point to the diagram of a vault door, explain the contact points, the time delay, the silent alarm that went straight to a central station in Long Island. Gas would lean over, eyes narrowed, and ask the same question every time. Where's the weak spot? Show me where this thing depends on one little piece of wire, one sensor, one guy half asleep in a booth. Over a decade, job after job in banks and jewelry stores from Manhattan to Nassau County, they learned every vulnerable angle. A service entrance shadowed by a taller building, a conduit that carried alarm wires alongside phone cables that could be quietly clipped, a ventilation shaft that opened into a forgotten utility room. The cops would later say the take from those jobs topped $100 million in cash, gems, and whatever people thought was safe behind steel. Vic and Gas only cared that their end went up the chain clean and that nobody got cute about it. Inside the bank tonight, the sound of the drill working on the top of a safe deposit vault was strangely gentle, like a dentist's tool on enamel. A safe man with grey at his temples worked by feel, using a specialized bit designed to miss the alarm contacts, while another held a padded flashlight. They weren't busting open the main door. That stayed pristine, so Monday morning the manager would walk into a mystery instead of a crime scene. The point was to come in from above, through reinforced concrete and into the honeycomb of boxes, because that was where the real money slept. Jewelry that never got appraised, cash that never got declared, bonds and bearer instruments people stashed away because they didn't trust anybody, including their own accountants. Vic and Gas stood off to the side by a row of desks, the glow of exit signs skimming their faces. "How long?" Gas asked. 10 more, the safe man said, without looking up. That was 10 more minutes with a van outside that didn't belong, and a light in the back stockroom that would be burning later than usual if anyone happened to pass. Vic walked to the window, keeping his shoulders below the line of sight, and eased a slat in the blind with 2 fingers. The street was what he wanted to see, empty, wet patches iridescent under the few streetlights, a bus rolling past without slowing. "We're good," he said. "Just be ready to move when he says done. No bullshit." They had rules on these runs, unwritten but enforced. No drugs on the job, no side pockets, no girlfriends anywhere near the planning or the celebrations afterward. A score like this didn't get chopped on a street corner or in some noisy bar. It went to a quiet back room in Bensonhurst or Canarsie, where the bags were opened and everything laid out on a table under a yellow light. Stacks of currency, banded with bank straps, watches laid in rows, velvet pouches turned inside out to spill diamonds and rubies that glittered. The specialists got theirs first, fixed percentages that kept them loyal and tight-lipped. Then, the envelopes for the higher-ups, parceled off with a kind of reverence, because the bypass gang wasn't just a crew, it was a revenue stream for the Lucchese hierarchy, and, on certain jobs, for friendly bosses in other families who'd put up introductions or protection. "This goes to Christie," Vic would say, pushing a packet across the table. "This one, ducks. Everybody gets fed." Gaspipe watched the hands that reached for what was left on the table. "You try to be slick," he'd say, "soft but with that edge. You try to stuff something in your shoe or your pocket, and I swear to God you won't see another roof. You'll just see the inside of a trunk." Nobody tested whether he meant it. Night after night, year after year through the 70s and into the 80s, the pattern repeated with small variations. A jewelry exchange in Midtown, where they went through a neighboring office and cut the wall. A Long Island bank where they used a rented construction sign and cones to park and work without drawing a second glance. A Brooklyn branch where they came up through the basement from a laundromat whose owner owed the family too much money to ever say no. The papers, when they noticed at all, wrote about phantom burglars and mystery crews, baffled by how alarms didn't ring, how vaults were pierced without crude damage, how no fingerprints turned up on anything. The cops knew the jobs weren't amateur work, but they didn't have a name that stuck yet. On the street, among guys who knew, the legend grew. A bypass gang that could walk around alarm systems like they were stepping over puddles. A pair of Brooklyn toughs acting as both overseers and enforcers, making sure the family's share was safe, even if nobody else was. Up on a roof or in a dark office, Vic and Gaspipe were just 2 shadows among many, but everyone in that room understood whose job it really was, who had the power to make it all go away, or to make someone disappear if they got greedy. The 19th hole sat on a Brooklyn block, golf flag buzzing in the window, smoke leaking out every time the door opened, and somebody stepped into the blast of jukebox noise and arguments over the Daily News sports page. It was a working man's bar with a wise guy's spine, the kind of joint where the regulars knew which stools belonged to which crew and where the back wall under the framed golf photos wasn't about birdies and bogeys. It was about Shylock points and layoff bets. At the center of it all was Christy Tick Fornari, thick glasses low on his nose, thinning hair combed straight back, sitting at the corner table like a manager in his office, the whole room his desk. When he looked up from his coffee cup and gave a nod, something moved. An envelope changed hands, a runner went out the door, or a problem got walked outside. That was the apprenticeship program he ran for his rookies. The quiet education in Cosa Nostra. Gaspipe Casso was one of the first to be put through it. Fresh off the docks, a high school dropout with a mean streak and a taste for violence that had already been honed on longshoremen he didn't like. Fornari made him a loan shark enforcer and a bookie, a kid who learned to walk into a tenement apartment with a smile and walk out with the rent money and the telephone cash and whatever else a desperate debtor had. Because when he said, "You're late again," people saw the part of him that laughed about dropping a forklift load on a guy's steel-toed boots just to see if they worked. On a sticky summer night in the mid-70s, Fornari introduced him to another comma, one who didn't talk loud but carried himself like he'd already survived 2 wars. Vittorio Vic Amuzzo, Little Vic, walked into the 19th hole in a pressed shirt and pomaded black brush cut, stocky body poured into a sport coat, the same kind of bull neck, bully boy frame Casso saw in the bathroom mirror every morning. "This is Vic," Christy said, doing the introductions like a guidance counselor with sharks. "You two, you're going to work together. Whatever I need, I don't want to say it twice." 11 years older but built from the same South Brooklyn scrap metal, Vic nodded once, sizing the younger guy up, and that was that. Soon, they were climbing into the same cars, running the same collection routes, stepping into the same rent-controlled kitchens and storefront backrooms, where debtors suddenly remembered where the money had been hiding. One stiff tried to tell them he didn't have it, that business was bad, that the trucks were late. Casso leaned against the refrigerator, arms folded. Vic stepped closer, crowding the doorway so the man had to look up at him. "Christy likes people who keep their word," Vic said evenly. "You don't keep your word. You're saying you don't respect him. You don't respect him. You don't respect us. And then we gotta fix that." It wasn't shouting, it was weight. The man came up with an envelope from inside a flour tin. Walking back to the car, Casso smirked. "You like being the good cop," he muttered. Vic shot back. "Who said I'm the good one?" In the parking lot glow, with those oval faces and slicked hair, they could have been brothers, 2 Brooklyn bullies finding out they worked best side by side. As their names started to mean something in the 19th hole crew, the work got heavier. It wasn't just knocking on doors for interest payments or writing numbers on the back of betting slips anymore. There were drug loads being whispered about, Thai heroin coming in under Sicilian supervision, marijuana shipments that needed muscle and brains to protect them. The Lucchese boss, Tony Ducks, preached the old party line about narcotics being forbidden. But on the ground level in Christie's crew, the hypocrisy was obvious. The money was too thick, and Fornari's 2 pets were too ambitious to stand on principle. They plunged into the traffic, fronting deals, guarding warehouses, sitting in on sit-downs where Sicilian brokers tried to shave points off the figure and were reminded quietly that they were dealing with the Lucchese family now. When one big transaction blew up into an arrest, both Vic and Gas found themselves in the system, indicted alongside Sicilian counterparts on heroin charges tied to dope smuggled from Thailand. They did what good wise guys did, kept their mouths shut, let the lawyers earn their envelopes, watched as witnesses got scared off or discredited, and they walked, the case dismissed for lack of evidence. Back at the 19th hole, when the news came down, the bar erupted with backslaps and free drinks. But beneath the surface, something more important had happened. 2 Brooklyn soldiers had taken a fall on a big-ticket case, beaten it, and shown the hierarchy they could swim in deep water without panicking. The violence that went with that status was almost a separate language. Christie didn't hand out contracts to kids he didn't trust with his own name attached. Casso had already proven himself with Lee Schleifer, the drug dealer who'd been suspected of talking to narco agents. Christie gave the order, Gaspipe lured him into a social club, and a .22 with a silencer did the rest. After that, there were more nights when the two of them went out together with heavier hardware, pistols and shotguns, once even a machine gun rigged with a suppressor. Climbing into beat-up cars with license plates that didn't belong to them, driving to lonely industrial blocks or side streets where some unfortunate had been marked down as disloyal, a thief, an informer. They carried out 4 of these assignments for Fornari in the 70s, 2 of them ending with corpses, 2 with targets miraculously living through their wounds. But whether the victims died or crawled into a hospital, everyone inside the life heard the same message. Christie Tick's Brooklyn crew had 2 executioners who would show up anywhere, anytime, and do it without fanfare. That kind of reputation stuck to them like their own cologne. By 1980, the little bar named for the 19th hole of a golf course had produced something rare: a captain being sent upstairs. Christie Tick was bumped up to consigliere of the entire Lucchese family, a promotion that came with an open question: who would take his old Brooklyn crew? The answer seemed obvious to everyone. Gaspipe, the deadly protege who'd done everything asked of him. Fornari made the offer, the way a father might offer a son the keys to the business. And that was where Casso made a move that said as much about his ambition as any gunshot ever could. He turned it down. "Give it to Vic," he told Christie. "He deserves it. He'll make you money." In that moment, he wasn't being humble so much as strategic. He saw his future not as one more captain battling for his slice, but as the consigliere's shadow, the aide-de-camp allowed by Borgata Protocol to stay glued to the family's brain. Christie took him up on it, keeping Casso at his side as his one personal soldier, while Vic took over the old crew and started raking in the certain profits that came with the captain's chair. From a modest flatlands house where his wife Lillian ran a lingerie shop and he pretended to be a trucker or a construction salesman, snowmelt and street salt clung to the curbs on Staten Island that night, the kind of damp winter air that made the Verrazano look like a ghost bridge hanging over the Narrows. Down a quiet side street lined with modest brick and vinyl-sided houses, one place stood out if you knew what to look for. A little too well kept, curtains drawn just so, a late-model Cadillac nosed in tight on the driveway. Inside Christie Tick Fornari's house, the front room looked like any older Italian couple's living room. Plastic runners on the carpet, religious prints on the walls, a ceramic Madonna in one corner. But the real gravity was in the back, behind a closed door where the voices were low and dangerous. It was January 1986, a month after Big Paul Castellano went down in a shower of bullets outside Sparks, and the room behind that door held 2 men who still believed they were supposed to be the ones who decided when a boss lived or died. Vincent Chin Gigante of the Genovese family and Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo of the Lucchese crime family. They sat at a dining room table stripped of its usual tablecloth, ashtrays crowding the wood, coffee cups cooling, the murmur of their talk carrying the weight of the commission itself. In the hallway beyond, Anthony Gaspipe Casso moved like a piece of furniture, present but invisible, a soldier cleared to be in the house, not in the meeting. He stayed by the kitchen, listening to the rise and fall of syllables through the door, knowing enough of the life to guess the subject without hearing every word. Castellano, Gotti, the commission, and blood. Fornari walked the line that night between host and consigliere. He made sure Chin had the good espresso, that Tony Ducks had a clear ashtray and a fresh pack of smokes, that his wife stayed upstairs and no curious relatives came by unannounced. The TV in the front room was on low, some late-night talk show, just in case anybody walking past glanced in the window. The sound helped mask the hum from the back. Inside that room, they dissected Gotti's move like surgeons picking over a botched operation. Castellano, whatever his flaws, had been a commission boss, one of theirs. To have him hit in the street without consultation was, to their minds, an insult to the entire structure, a spit in the face of the rules that kept the 5 families from tearing the city apart. Gotti's public line, that the Gambinos were looking for the killers of their boss, was treated with open contempt. They knew, everyone knew. "He went off on his own," one of them said, voice tight. "Like this is some movie, like there's no commission." The conversation circled back to the same conclusion. A cannon had been broken. Castellano hadn't just been killed, he'd been killed without permission. That meant the ledger was now open, and somewhere, somehow, there had to be a price paid by John Gotti and his right-hand man, Frank DeCicco. By the time they pushed back their chairs and stood, stretching aging backs and flicking stray ash from their sleeves, the decision had hardened into something like liturgy. Gotti and Frankie had to die, and not quietly. The next night the house felt different, like the air itself had been tuned. The visiting bosses were gone. There was no Chin in a rumpled overcoat, no Tony Ducks moving slowly up the walk. Instead, 2 Brooklyn wolves stepped out of the cold and into the warmth. Vic Amuzzo, solid and compact in a dark overcoat, and Casso in his usual low-key get-up, heavy shoulders under a simple jacket, eyes that never stopped inventorying a room. Funari brought them into the kitchen first, away from the front windows, away from the neighbors' eyes. The table here was smaller, covered with a floral tablecloth, a bowl of fruit pushed aside to make room for an ashtray, and 3 coffee cups. Funari didn't waste their time with small talk. The TV was off now. This wasn't about appearances, this was about orders. He leaned on his forearms, voice low but charged. He told them about the night before, about Chin and Ducks sitting in the back room, about the disgust in their faces when Gotti's name came up, about the agreement they reached. Not a suggestion, not a maybe, but a decision from the top. Castellano's murder had to be avenged, and the people wearing that responsibility were sitting at his kitchen table right now. "They want Gotti and DeCicco," Funari said, making eye contact with each of them so there'd be no misunderstanding. "Both of them. This ain't talk. This is the commission talking. They picked you too." Casso absorbed it with that flat look of his, giving away nothing but interest. Months earlier, when Frankie DeCicco had quietly sounded him out about the idea of hitting Castellano, Gaspipe had shrugged and said he didn't give a fuck about Paul either way. That had been the luxury of a soldier watching a war above his pay grade. Now the war had slid down the chain and landed in his lap, and it was personal in a different way. Not loyalty to Paul, but loyalty to the structure that made men like him matter. Vic listened with his jaw set, already thinking ahead to logistics, neighborhoods, traffic patterns, escape routes. They both knew what it meant to be chosen for something like this. One successful double hit, and their names would be carved in the shadows forever. One misstep, and the same people who gave the order could decide they'd become liabilities. "You're saying the Chin himself wants it this way?" Casso finally said, just to hear it out loud. Funari nodded. "The Chin, Ducks, everybody," he said. "They want a message sent, and they want it sent loud." Then came the twist, the tactical directive Funari laid out like a strange sacrament. No close-range pistol work, no walk-up at a social club, no classic mobbed-up restaurant hit. The bosses wanted a bomb, something the American mafia had always treated like contraband, a Sicilian toy that drew too much heat, too much collateral damage, too many headlines. In this case, that was the point. An explosion on the street would look like a lot of things before it looked like a commission-sanctioned hit. Drug beef, personal vendetta, foreign scores settling old Italian grudges. It might even push the cops and papers to blame nameless zips from overseas. and keep attention off the American bosses quietly rebalancing the scales. They figure a big bang, nobody's going to see our fingerprints, Fenari explained, tapping ash into the tray. They get their justice for Paul, and Gotti don't know where to aim if he wants to shoot back. Casso imagined it as he listened. Twisted metal, glass rained over a Brooklyn street, Gotti or Dashiko or both ripped apart in an instant, and weighed the practical problems. Sourcing plastic explosive, a trigger that wouldn't misfire, a place to plant it without getting seen. Still, a slow smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. It appealed to the part of him that liked puzzles, that liked turning the Commission's no bombs rule inside out. By the time they left the Staten Island house, the neighborhood quiet and black under a low sky, the outlines of the revenge were already forming in their heads. Out on the curb, their breath ghosted in the cold as they walked toward their cars. Vic talked about patterns, where Gotti liked to eat, where he liked to hold court, the fact that he bounced from club to club behind a screen of bodyguards. "He don't sit still," Vic muttered. "We gotta catch him where he feels safe." Casso, hands jammed in his pockets, was already thinking of who they'd need to bring in, and one name floated to the top. Herbie Blue Eyes Pate, the Genovese bomb man, who could turn a toy and a stick of C4 into a remote-controlled death sentence. Somewhere behind them, Fornari watched from the front window, the soft glow of a table lamp behind his shoulder, making sure they were gone clean before he killed the light. Inside that hushed Staten Island box, two worlds coexisted. The respectable house of an aging Italian couple, and the war room where the murder of a New York folk hero in a Brioni suit was being carefully scripted. Out on the street, Gaspipe and Vic slid behind the wheel, pulled away from the curb, and crossed the island toward the bridge with the kind of quiet conviction that comes when the top of the life has put the gun in your hand and pointed at the target for you. Big Paul was in the ground, Gotti was on the front pages, and from that night, in Fornari's kitchen forward, the Lucchese and Genovese answer to Sparks was no longer a question of if, but how. On a bright September afternoon in 1986, Brooklyn looked almost harmless, all sunshine on brick and chrome, kids squealing in front of a corner Carvel while their mothers watched from double-parked cars. Anthony Casso came rolling up that block in his Cadillac like it was any other day, one elbow in the open window, the radio low, his mind on money. Stolen bearer bonds were the headline in his head, a sizable package that, according to a Gambino associate, needed a smart fence and the kind of quiet muscle only a Lucchese heavyweight could bring. On paper, it was a fat score, the kind of business that kept a man like him swimming in cash and respect. In reality, he was driving straight into a kill box and didn't know it. He eased the caddy into a spot right in front of the Carvel, the pastel sign reflected in his windshield, the air thick with the smell of sugar and exhaust. Across the street was the little restaurant where the meet was supposed to happen, close to his home turf, close enough that he didn't even feel the usual itch between his shoulder blades. No trailing sedans, no strange faces on the sidewalk. In his world, if somebody was going to move on a guy like him, he figured he'd feel it before he saw it. Today, the only thing he felt was the mild annoyance of looking for change for the meter. The other car came in quiet, drifting up alongside, like it was just another impatient driver hunting for a space near the ice cream shop. There were at least 3 of them inside, hard faces behind rolled-up glass, hands on guns that were already out of sight. 1 second, Casso was reaching for the ignition. The next, the driver's side window exploded inward in a hail of glass and fire. A shotgun barked first, the blast punching through the window and into his left side, followed by a burst of smaller rounds that chewed into the Cadillac's interior, stitching his back and arm with hot pain. The world collapsed into noise and shattered safety glass, the kids on the sidewalk screaming as their mothers yanked them toward doorways and behind parked cars. Casso hadn't brought a gun that day. No reason, he thought. Broad daylight, neighborhood spot, a simple business sit-down. And now, his only weapon was the instinct that had kept him alive through a lifetime of violence. He dropped low, felt the seat rip under him, and then, somehow, the shooting stopped. The attacker's car screeched away, tires spitting gravel, leaving behind a Cadillac full of smoke, and a man who should have been dead slumped over the steering wheel, bleeding onto the column shifter. He forced the door open with his good arm, the sound of it creaking wide, weirdly calm after the chaos. The street seemed too bright now, the sun a hot slap on his face as he staggered out of the car, blood slicking his shirt, his hand already pressing against the wet warmth spreading across his back and arm. Across from the Carvel, the restaurant's front windows were filled with stunned faces, waiters frozen mid-step, customers half risen from their chairs. Casso lurched off the curb and into the crosswalk, weaving between abandoned cars, his footsteps leaving uneven red dots on the asphalt. Inside, he crashed through the door, grabbing the nearest tablecloth and yanking it off the table, glasses and silverware clattering to the floor in a spray. He wrapped the white fabric around himself, jamming it hard against the worst of the bleeding, jaw clenched, eyes scanning for something, anything, that looked like cover. "Downstairs," somebody finally hissed, a low voice from behind the counter, the survival instinct of people who understood that whatever was happening, talking to the cops about it later was not in their best interest. They hustled him through a narrow doorway toward the basement, the smell of food giving way to detergent, cold concrete, and metal stairs. In the basement, they shoved open the heavy metal door of the walk-in freezer, and the breath was punched out of him all over again, this time by the cold. He stumbled inside, the tablecloth already stiffening, breath erupting in white clouds. The door closed behind him with a dull clank, turning the world into humming compressors and blue-white light. He slid down the wall, back scraping the metal, and sat there with his knees bent, gasping, his own heartbeat thunder in his ears. Out on the sidewalk, sirens started to build, first distant, then closer. The inevitable swarm of NYPD and paramedics converging on a bullet-riddled Cadillac parked in front of an ice cream store full of traumatized kids. Upstairs, the restaurant staff were already shrugging, shaking their heads, telling the cops they didn't know anything beyond the fact that some man had run off, or maybe he'd left before the shooting, or maybe they just hadn't seen clearly. In neighborhoods like this, windows don't have eyes when bullets fly, especially not when the victim is a face people have seen sitting in the corner of the Walnut Bar or talking low in the back of a social club. In the freezer, Casso shivered uncontrollably, but his mind was clearing, rage knitting itself together with pain. Somebody had tried to kill him over money. His money, Lucchese money, and he was still breathing. That meant the balance sheet had just flipped. Eventually, the noise upstairs shifted from frantic to mechanical, the wail of sirens giving way to the chug of engines and the grind of radios. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't a cop standing there, but one of the restaurant workers, eyes wide, whispering that the street was clearing, that the cops were more interested in the car than in who'd been driving it. Casso hauled himself up, the cold having slowed the bleeding, but leaving his limbs heavy and numb. He staggered back up the stairs, wrapped in the blood-stained tablecloth like a parody of a patient, and found a phone. His world in those seconds narrowed to one name. He dialed with clumsy fingers, and when the familiar voice answered, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "Vic," he rasped. "They just tried to clip me." On the other end, somewhere in Brooklyn, Vittorio Vic Amuso, now the man who would soon be godfather of the Lucchese family, absorbed the news in silence, then said he was on his way. Minutes later, he pulled up near the restaurant, scooped Casso into another car, and turned the wheel toward a hospital. away from the scene where the cops were scratching their heads over a shot-up Cadillac and a missing driver. It was classic mob triage. Get the man out, leave the car, let the blue suits chase ghosts. At the hospital, the game shifted to one Casso knew almost as well as the street. Detectives got wind of the wounded man arriving bloody and half frozen, followed the trail, and soon enough they were at his bedside, notebooks open, questions loaded. He lay there bandaged, color back in his face, eyes hooded, playing the role he'd honed over decades of arrests without convictions. Why had someone tried to murder him in broad daylight? Did it have anything to do with organized crime? Did he know anyone who'd want him dead? Casso shrugged it all off with a line that was equal parts insult and performance. "There's nobody who doesn't like me," he told them. "I don't know nothing about organized crime." The cops weren't amused. Back at the Carvel scene, they'd found something in his Cadillac that made their jaws tighten. A confidential NYPD list of license plate numbers used on unmarked surveillance cars. A cheat sheet for spotting law enforcement tails at a glance. Now, they wanted to know where he'd gotten it, who he knew inside. Casso played dumb, blinking, denying, shrugging, as if the list had just dropped out of the sky into his glove box. When he was finally discharged, hit in the back and left arm, but stable, ornery, very much alive, he left the hospital with more enemies than when he went in, on both sides of the law. In his head, though, the ledger had already started filling in. A Gambino capo named Michael Mickey Boy Paradiso, a festering beef over a heroin score, and the fact that the commission trial had frozen the usual sit-down channels that might have kept something like this from turning into bullets. Somebody had used a Carvel rendezvous as a ruse to ambush him. Now, walking out into the Brooklyn light with fresh scars, Gaspipe Casso quietly promised himself that every name tied to that setup was going to end up on the wrong side of a gun. By the late 1980s, when most wise guys still treated cops like an unpredictable storm you ducked and hoped to outlast, Anthony Casso had done something different, something worse. He'd bought himself a weather report. In his world, the heat didn't come out of nowhere anymore. It came on schedule, in advance, whispered over phones, relayed in quiet booths, delivered as manila envelopes and photocopied sheets that laid out the movements of the NYPD and the FBI like a racing form. Two New York City detectives, on the books as elite organized crime investigators, sworn to hunt down men like him, were, in his private language, my detectives. A pair of ghosts embedded in the system who turned the machinery of law enforcement into his own personal crystal ball. Through them, the random chaos of raids, surveillance, indictments and grand juries became a flow of information that could be catalogued, monetized and exploited. They were not friends, but they were assets, and in Casso's ledgers, they were filed under overhead, just another cost of doing business, right next to Shylock income and kickbacks from concrete company. The arrangement didn't start with a handshake in some smoky backroom. It started one layer removed, filtered through a middleman who understood both worlds. Burton Kaplan, a Lucchese associate who moved like a broker through the grey space between mob and straight life, became the pipeline. When Casso wanted eyes inside the NYPD and even the FBI, Kaplan knew who to reach. For the right price, an FBI agent and two city detectives were quietly brought into the circle. Not as partners, but as vendors. People who understood that information was a commodity and that Gaspipe would pay top dollar. Casso later said it was Kaplan who contacted and paid off the trio, keeping things insulated so that the underboss never had to speak directly to the federal man and only once crossed paths with the detectives in person. The terms were simple. They got a base monthly retainer, $1,000 to $1,500 a month apiece from Casso's city, sometimes as much as $4,000 according to later indictments, with bonuses for special assignments that required extra risk. Every envelope Kaplan handed over didn't just buy silence, it bought time. Advance warning of wiretaps, grand jury subpoenas, pending arrests, and most prized of all, names. Names of informants, names of suspects, names of men who had started talking and didn't yet realize that the echo carried back to Brooklyn. Even before the blood had dried from the Carvel ambush, his Cadillac riddled, his back and arm full of shotgun and pistol wounds, detectives in a hospital room pretending to care what had just happened. Casso's intelligence operatives from inside the NYPD were already moving. They had access to case files, surveillance photos, informant reports, all the raw material that regular cops use to build prosecutions. Casso used the same material to build hit lists. Through a Lucchese associate who served as the go-between, he'd already worked out a standing deal. If the police or FBI opened an investigation into the Lucchese family, he was to hear about it first. If someone became an informant or a potential witness, their name and address were to find their way, discreetly, into his hands. Now he wanted something more specific. The gunman who'd tried to kill him outside that ice cream store. Within days, the dirty detectives provided just that. His name, his file photo, the kind of internal material that never should have left a secure office. They did it for several $1,000s a month, and the promise that special jobs would come with special paydays. One of those paydays later included a confidential NYPD list, the license plate numbers of unmarked surveillance cars, a cheat sheet that transformed potential tails into instantly recognizable ghosts in his rearview mirror. James Heidel, sometimes rendered Heidel, was the first big test of the system, and it worked exactly the way Casso imagined when he decided to put cops on his payroll. Heidel was no civilian. He was a small-time Staten Island trafficker, a half-Italian Gambino associate, and, more importantly, one of the shooters in the Carvel hit, protected now by paranoia and a growing awareness that a man like Casso wasn't the type to let things go. Gaspipe bragged later that the kid was jumpy, impossible to get near. That was fine. He didn't plan on getting near him himself. He planned on having the law deliver him. Kaplan passed along the order. The FBI agent pinpointed Heidel's movements, and the two NYPD detectives executed a fake arrest right there in Brooklyn, flashing their shields, telling Heidel there was a warrant, cuffing him like any other perch. They loaded him into a green unmarked car, one Casso had conveniently bought at auction, then drove him to a closed garage, pulled him out of the back seat, stuffed him into the trunk, and took him to a Toys R Us parking lot where Casso was waiting. It was the only time he shook their hands in person, a brief, almost polite moment where the underboss of the Lucchese family thanked two of New York's finest for delivering a man to be tortured and murdered. For this job alone, the trio split $75,000, $25,000 apiece, the kind of bonus that made any moral line blur into a money-colored haze. In the basement of a house in Bergen Beach, with the green car parked neatly outside and the trunk finally popped, Heidel found out what it meant to stand on the wrong side of Casso's crystal ball. The underboss used him as target practice for hours, shooting him in the legs, arms, and body, careful not to hit anything immediately fatal. A man who'd once thought he could hide behind the chaos of the city now found that chaos had been stripped away. Someone inside the shield had pointed a finger and said, "There." Only after Heidel had given up the names of the rest of the Carvel hit team did Casso end it with a final shot to the head. The body vanished. No one ever found it. Behind that disappearance, though, was a paper trail of bribe money and inside information. Detectives paging through restricted files and leaking names, addresses, and photos to the very man their unit was officially trying to nail. When Casso spoke about it later, there was no shame, only a kind of vicious satisfaction. "I had the law on my side," he sneered, recalling how he hadn't worried about the screaming kid kicking at the trunk in a crowded Toys R Us lot, because he knew that if anything went sideways, he had two armed detectives standing right there to smooth it over. But a crystal ball doesn't just show you what you want to see. Sometimes it distorts, and the distortion gets innocent people killed. Later, when his private execution squad went hunting for another member of the Carvel team, a guy named Nicholas Guido, Casso again turned to his detectives. "Find me Guido," he told them. "Bring me his address." Somewhere between the databases and the handwritten notes, the files, and the street-level assumptions, something went wrong. The detectives produced the address for the wrong Nicholas Guido, a 26-year-old telephone installer who shared the name, but not the life. On Christmas Day 1986, Lucchese shooters gunned that young man down outside his Brooklyn home, in front of his family's world, because two sworn officers of the law had misidentified their target while moonlighting as spies for the mob. There was no satisfaction in that killing, no sense that a ledger had been balanced. It was a clerical error with a corpse at the end of it. Casso's reaction, when he recounted it years later, was chilling in its indifference. "Hey, it's a mistake. No big deal." The real Nicholas Guido fled to Florida and turned himself in on an assault charge, figuring that life in prison was safer than freedom in a city where the law could hand you to gaspipe with a typo. As the Amuso Casso regime dug in, those detectives became more than revenge tools. They turned into a structural part of how the Lucchese crime family ran its business and its purge. When a Bronx soldier like Anthony DeLapi tried to outrun the new bosses by relocating to California, the story inside the family was that he'd been disloyal, conspiring with his imprisoned uncle against Tony Duck's Corralo. The story inside Casso's circle was simpler. He had detectives with access to cross-country information. With their help, he traced DeLapi to the West Coast, a Teamsters business agent who thought distance would keep him safe, and sent a 4-man hit team to gun him down. 10 grand in travel expenses, a few phone calls, and a name on a piece of paper had turned Los Angeles into an extension of a Brooklyn street corner. When rumors surfaced that another Lucchese soldier, Bruno Facciolo, might have talked to authorities about that same DeLapi hit, the detectives again played their part, reporting that in their view he was working with the FBI. That label, RAT, stamped via information from men wearing badges, signed his death warrant. Lured to an auto body shop in Brooklyn by his own people, Facciolo realized too late that he'd been set up. Dragged inside, denied even a last phone call to his daughter, he was shot and stabbed, and his body later turned up in a trunk with a canary stuffed in his mouth. The oldest mafia message in New York. This is what happens to those who sing. From his side, Casso treated the whole setup with the same cold bookkeeping he brought to loan shark ledgers and construction scams. Al Darko, his Professor Capo, later described how Casso meticulously recorded every payment coming in and every expense going out, including bribes to corrupt lawmen. Just another line item in a mob balance sheet that now topped $1 million a year in tribute and shakedowns. In that framework, the detectives' monthly envelopes and special bonuses weren't shocking. They were sound investments. The money bought him advance notice when indictments loomed. It bought him the addresses of enemies in hiding. It bought him confirmation of who might be talking and who wasn't. It bought him the confidence to move through Brooklyn like a man who believed the traffic lights would always flip green when he approached. For almost a decade, from 1985 until his arrest in 1993, according to later federal indictments, those two cops fed him the future, and he used it to bury his past. And a long list of other people, under concrete, in trunks, and sometimes in unmarked graves, that still haven't been found. Years later, sitting in prison, Casso would point his finger back up the food chain, naming Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa as the "my detectives" who had served as his eyes and ears inside the NYPD. Prosecutors eventually confirmed much of what he'd bragged about, indicting the retired partners for being, in effect, hitmen with shields. Men who had stopped Frank Lino on a Brooklyn highway before delivering him to a murder squad who had yanked Heidel off the street so Casso could torture him in Bergen Beach, who had turned confidential law enforcement intelligence into a menu of targets for a mafia underboss. By then, the old arrangement was gone, the crystal ball shattered, its pieces scattered across courtrooms, FBI reports, and the memories of men who had once thought having the law on their side meant they could never truly lose. For nearly a decade of the Amuso-Casso reign, though, those two detectives turned the idea of law and order in New York on its head. While the newspapers talked about task forces and mob crackdowns, in the real power circuits of Brooklyn and the Bronx, the equation looked different. Millions in rackets pouring in, bodies disappearing, and the underboss of the Lucchese family flipping through inside police information like tomorrow's weather report, knowing when the storm would hit and who was going to get struck first. The autumn light on Staten Island had that tired, smoky quality. The sky over the Narrows, the same grey as the exhaust from the bridge. Inside Christy Tick Fenari's house, the shades were drawn just enough to make the living room feel like a den. Table lamps casting amber halos over plastic-covered furniture and framed family photos that somehow never included the men who really mattered. At the dining room table, Tony Duck's Corallo sat shorter than his legend, but heavier than his mugshot. 60-ish, compact, the stocky boss whose whole life had been dedicated to slipping past subpoenas and indictments. The man who got his nickname for ducking cases the way other men ducked punches. Tonight, there was no ducking. The commission trial downtown was grinding toward verdicts, and Ducks, who had spent decades keeping his family as calm as a well-run business, could read the writing on the wall as clearly as any prosecutor. The Lucchese family leadership, himself, underboss Tom Mix Santoro, consigliere Christy Tick, was about to be decimated, hit harder by the case than any of the other four families. He knew it in his bones. The next time he left a courtroom, it would be in shackles, on his way to die behind a fence. He hadn't summoned anyone here to debate that. He'd summoned them to make sure what came after him didn't look like the chaos and civil wars that had ripped through the other families. For more than 50 years, the Luccheses had bragged that power passed peacefully, from Gaetano Gagliano to Tommy Lucchese, and then to Tony Ducks himself, without a bomb or a bullet aimed at a sitting boss, without an internal war splitting crews down the middle. He wanted that streak to survive him. When Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso were ushered into the house and steered past the bland front room toward the dining area, they felt the gravity in the air immediately. No bar chatter, no women, just low voices, and the smell of espresso going stale on saucers. They were both products of Brooklyn, thick-shouldered, dark-haired, men who'd grown up in the shadow of rail yards and brick walk-ups, who'd made their reputations breaking legs for Christie's loans, and then graduating up to million-dollar bypass jobs and heroin scores. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Ducks, who had preached for years that narcotics meant death, was now leaning hardest on two men who had gotten rich in exactly that forbidden world. Vic, who had already done time on a heroin conviction, and Casso, who had beaten his own drug case and gone on earning. He saw them differently now, not as rule breakers, but as exceptional earners, the kind of producers who kept a Borgata competitive when everyone else was getting squeezed by RICO and wiretaps. That night, in Fornari's Staten Island dining room, he sat at the head of the table and let them stand in front of him for a beat, as if he were weighing them on a scale only he could read. Then he said, almost conversationally, that the life they knew was over. The commission trial was going to bury the current administration. Him, Tom, Christy. There was no melodrama in his voice, just a flat acknowledgement. I'm finished, he told them in essence, and when he said it, it wasn't a plea, it was a fact. He wanted what came next to be orderly. He laid it out in his measured, slightly rasping way. The Lucchese family had stayed strong because it had never turned succession into a blood sport. That could not change now, even as the government was about to lock the doors on the top three. Someone had to come up, to sit in his chair and keep the tithe flowing from Manhattan's garment center, from the Bronx, from Jersey, from Brooklyn, to make sure contractors still paid their labor piece. Shylock customers still found their interest rates going up instead of down, and rival mobsters understood that the Lucchese's were not open territory. Swayed by Christie's lobbying, Fornari, after all, had raised both these men in his own crew. Dux told them he had narrowed it to the two of them. In his mind, they were the best candidates to take over the helm, despite having little formal managerial experience. They'd proven their loyalty to him and to Christie. They'd brought gold to the table for years, and in an era where the government was ripping into every traditional racket, they'd shown they could adapt and still bring him envelopes. The fact that much of that gold came from the very heroin business he'd officially forbidden under penalty of death no longer mattered. The rules were one thing when you were on top, another when you were staring at life. Then he said the line that would echo in court transcripts years later, reduced down to a single sentence, but here rolling out into the smoky room with the weight of a papal decree. One of them has to come up, he told Christie, meaning one of Amuso or Casso. He wasn't going to flip a coin in front of them. That wasn't his style. Instead, he pushed back his chair a little, let the tension settle, and nodded to Fornari. Christie, the bespectacled consigliere who'd turned the 19th hole into a training ground and had made these two into what they were, rose and motioned with his hand. "Come on," he said, crooking a finger like a father calling in sons. He led them into the next room, a quieter space, maybe a den with a crucifix on the wall and a framed wedding photo half crooked, closing the door behind them so Dux couldn't hear the words, only the outcome. In there, the official record goes silent. What survives is Casso's version, told later from a cell, that Christie explained the boss's instruction, that one of them had to take the title, and that Gaspipe, playing the modest, loyal protégé, said he didn't want the headache, that Vic should be the one to wear the crown. He'd already once declined a promotion for himself, urging Christie years earlier to make Vic captain of the old Brooklyn crew, instead of him, so he could stay as the consigliere's one personal soldier. Now he was framing himself again as the man behind the throne, the enforcer and strategist, who didn't need the word boss in front of his name to run things. When they came back into the dining room, the decision had been made, and everyone in that house understood the choreography. Vic took the spot slightly closer to Dux, Casso a half step behind and to the side, the way an underboss in waiting would stand even before the titles were official. Dux, who had spent a lifetime avoiding responsibility in court, accepted responsibility here with a nod. At the conclusion of that Staten Island meeting, he designated Vittorio, Little Vic Amuso, as the heir to assume his post as soon as the marshals took him away for good. He didn't speak in flowery terms about legacy. He spoke like a man closing a ledger. As soon as he, Tom Santoro, and Christie Tick were trucked off to life sentences, Vic would be boss, and Casso, though no one said it aloud yet, would quickly climb into the consigliere's chair and then the underboss slot, giving Brooklyn's upstart wing full control of a family that had always been run from Manhattan and the Bronx. Dux believed, or at least needed to believe, that this was his parting gift to the family, a peaceful transfer of power, a line of succession decided not in some parking lot ambush, but in a Staten Island dining room under the watchful eyes of Madonna statues and family portraits. As 1987 began and the old hierarchy disappeared into federal prisons, law enforcement logs would simply record that Little Vic Amuso had succeeded Corallo as Lucchese boss, the first time the family's Brooklyn faction had gained control, while Anthony Casso, his sidekick, quietly took the driver's seat as underboss in all but name. What none of them admitted that night, not even to themselves, was how fragile that orderly transition really was. Outside Staten Island's tidy houses, the family they were handing over was already divided into three uneasy sectors: Manhattan Bronx, Brooklyn, New Jersey, with older, more experienced capos in the first two looking sideways at the sudden rise of these Brooklyn guys who'd made their bones in Christie's bars instead of in the traditional heartland. Federal prosecutors listening to bugs and flipping informants would later conclude that, whatever the titles, Amuso has the title of boss, but the brains and driving force behind the family is Gaspipe, and that the smooth handoff Corallo had tried to engineer in this quiet house was going to mutate into something far uglier, a paranoid reign that would leave bodies scattered from the Bronx to Florida. But in that moment, as Dux pushed his chair back and the two Brooklyn bullies nodded their acceptance, all anyone in the room allowed themselves to see was the surface, the continuity, the tradition, the idea that the Lucchese's were doing what they had always prided themselves on doing, choosing the next boss indoors with coffee instead of gunpowder, and pretending that from here on out the family's future would be as stable as its past. What do you think was the real turning point? Casso surviving the Carvel hit, or him realizing he had the NYPD on his payroll, like a crystal ball? If the dirty detectives never fed Casso Heidel's info and that Toys R Us grab never happened, do you think the Lucchese war machine would have slowed down? Or would Gaspipe have found another way to get his revenge? How much blame do you put on the cops for the wrong Nicholas Guido getting killed on Christmas? Just a bad ID, or straight-up murder for hire with a badge? Do you think Tony Dux made the right call naming little Vic as boss instead of Gaspipe, or did that decision just guarantee the family was going to be run from the shadows by the more dangerous guy anyway? If you were a made guy in the Lucchese family at that time, who would you have feared more, the official boss Vic Amuso, or the under-the-radar power of Gaspipe Casso with cops and killers both answering his calls?